This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Josh Kraushaar is the National Journal's managing political editor. He writes a weekly column called Against the Grain with some of the best analysis out there of what's happening in American politics, and he's offered his political analysis in the past on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, C-SPAN, and other outlets. With the midterm election coming up this November, we talked to him about how the U.S. economy is impacting voters' political attitudes, including their opinions of the president and of Congress, and about what he thinks is likely to happen in the election. We also got into some interesting things he's observed as someone who's really up close in D.C. and who spends a lot of time watching how politicians think and behave. As a quick reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask a question. We host and welcome voices from across the political spectrum. Our one rule is to keep it civil. For a schedule of live events, as well as past episodes, and to sign up for our illustrious newsletter, which will deliver our best of to your inbox twice per month, please visit our website, pm101.live. Our next episode this Monday will feature Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times, someone who knows a lot about relationships between nations, including in Europe as Russia builds up its military forces along the borders of Ukraine. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and give us a rating on whichever streaming service you're using right now. It's a huge help as our community grows. It takes literally 2 seconds. Subscribing will also ensure you don't miss out on Monday with Stephen. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Josh, I wanted to start out with the most recent current events. We just passed January 6th. And from a media perspective in the conservative arena, we have folks like Tucker Carlson. We have folks in Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar. And while these people aren't the full caucus, aren't the full faction of the GOP, they have considerable platforms and they are terrorist sympathizers. So the Democrats look like they are poised to take advantage of this issue or attempt to take advantage of this issue in midterms. My question is, does this matter? Will this issue actually resonate with voters?
The challenge for Democrats is that voters aren't as concerned about looking back at January 6th as a voting issue as, the Democrats hope they are. I could see some Republicans so closely tied to Trump, so closely engaged in this election denialism that would pay a political penalty because of their extremism. But by and large, I just don't see this issue being central to voters' minds. And frankly, the Republican candidates nominated in a lot of these big battleground states, districts, and all these key races that we're following, I don't see that being like a topic of conversation. Republicans have learned, and we saw this during the Trump administration, to sort of dodge the question, that they're not going to go to where Liz Cheney is. They're not going to speak out against the extremism within their party. But at the same time, they're not going to indulge the same fantasies and conspiracy theories that former President Trump so ably showed us at the rally this past weekend in Arizona. So, ultimately, the bigger issues for voters are the economy, inflation, COVID, and when are we going to kind of get out of the malaise that we're in with the latest Omicron variant. And immigration, crime, sort of these secondary issues that are really moving to the forefront in voters' minds as events on the ground dictate. It'll be mood music. You're certainly going to hear maybe the National Democratic Party put out videos or statements trying to connect Republicans to Donald Trump and to January 6th. But by and large, I don't expect it to be a significant or central issue in most of these big campaigns.
I would be a one-issue voter. This would determine my outlook, but I'm not also caught up in the DC bubble where I think that everything that I think resonates with the electorate. I guess following up on that, the GOP is very, very likely to retake the House. That's my opinion. It's the opinion of a lot of people, and maybe Democrats aren't willing to kind of admit that just yet. But to retake the House, they're going to need to craft a message that is effective and that resonates with different types of voters. So my question here is going to be twofold for you. Can they craft a message that is effective in turning out the base, but also thread that needle to win the suburban voters that Trump lost, for example, in Georgia in 2020? And a follow-up on that is, do they even need to worry about winning back those suburban voters in a midterm election where we have the factors that you just outlined?
So the biggest advantage that Republicans have politically is that they're not in power. They don't hold the presidency, they don't hold the House, and they don't hold the Senate. And the fundamental rule of politics is that in a midterm election, when you're the out party, you don't need to necessarily have like an agenda, a positive platform, even though that would help, I would think. You can basically run as the opposition. You can run as the loyal opposition and capitalize on the governing party's struggles in taming the pandemic. It struggles in getting the economy back into a healthy situation. There's so many divisions within the Republican Party. They're perhaps a little bit muted because they're not in power anymore. But the bigger challenge is going to be the party that actually is governing. They set the tone for the policy agenda and the political agenda. The burden's going to be on the Democratic Party. So again, not to repeat myself, but in races, especially Senate races that are a little more centered on personalities and individuals more than the overall mood of the public towards the parties in the House. In the Senate, maybe Republicans nominate someone who is out of the mainstream in one of these big swing Senate races, and that has a consequential effect on the outcome in that race. But on the macro level, Republicans don't need to put out a contract with America. They don't need to, be specific about what their policy agenda is, because ultimately what voters, now and before almost always vote on the governing party. It's a referendum largely on whether they think Biden and the Democrats controlling Congress are doing a good job or not.
So I want to dig in on the economy, and then we'll get into some of these Senate races and other issues that could impact things. But the economic numbers, the outlook from your analysts at big Wall Street firms, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, even Jamie Dimon, for example, he is predicting blowout numbers, 4-5% growth. He also said that this is the best economic outlook for everyday Americans in 50 years when you look at balance sheets. So debt to available income ratio. But it appears that the economic potential success, or where we're standing in as a country right now, is not resonating with a lot of voters. There was a recent poll that showed the economy is the top issue for voters, 68% of them over COVID-19. Why is this economic revival not being rewarded by the voters for the Democrats? And does the economic issues still matter like they used to maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
Yeah, so first, I don't see this as an economic revival. Jenna, I'm not an economist, but number one, inflation has wiped out all the income gains that have taken place over the last year. So even though incomes have gone up, there's been the child tax credit that puts money in the pocket of certain Americans with families, certain parents, and also the $1,400 check that was passed along to a lot of families at the beginning of the Biden administration. The reality is that the inflation has wiped out both those income transfers, those gains, and also the rise in income throughout the last year and a half. These same economic experts, these same Wall Street leaders who were blasé about the nature of inflation at the beginning of the year, who didn't think that pouring of $1.9 trillion into the economy at a time when we already had poured a lot of stimulus into the economy during an economic boom wouldn't have any negative implications. They were proven wrong. So I'm a little bit confounded by some of these experts and some of these Wall Street leaders that seem to be. I mean, we were starting at a very low point given the trough of the pandemic, the layoffs that took place in early 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020. The predictions, the optimism that was outlined at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the Biden administration, didn't come to fruition for a good reason, because the promised economic gains didn't materialize. Inflation wiped out any of the good positive news that you can kind of cherry pick out there.
So Josh, you're telling me that Wall Street elites are out of touch?
Well, I think you pointed to a good example of that. Justin, I remember watching the Fed chair. I mean, again, I kind of just, I follow the economic news just like anyone else. I don't have any special expertise in that area. But I saw on 60 Minutes when the Fed chair gave a widely watched interview at the beginning of the year, declaring that any inflation was merely transitory and this was nothing to worry about, and it was all a bunch of overhyped nonsense. And now he's backtracked just 6 months later. That doesn't give you a lot of credibility. That doesn't give you a lot of optimism that our leading economic figures have a grasp on what's going on. So look, all I can say is that this administration on the economic front has a credibility challenge. They have made promises, they have made predictions, they have downplayed a lot of the negative outcomes that we've seen, whether it's inflation, whether it's supply chain issues, whether just it's the overall macroeconomic state of play here at the end or at the beginning rather of 2022. So look, I think there is a partisanship to how people feel about the economy, to be sure. Like we've seen that for the last decade where, Democrats, even in a bad economy under Obama, tend to be more optimistic than Republicans. And when Trump was president, when there were some economic headwinds, the COVID headwinds, Republicans were more optimistic than Democrats. So that's to be expected. But you're seeing a pretty overwhelming share of voters who are just downcast, pessimistic about the state of the economy, and it goes beyond partisan lines. You see a decent number of Democrats also having more pessimistic views about their economic future, about the state of the economy writ large. And even the vice president, Kamala Harris, gave an interview last week, I believe, where she used the infamous M word, the malaise word that has not been spoken by a Democrat since, I believe, Jimmy Carter. It was sort of a verboten word to say in Democratic circles from the Carter experience.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course.
Jimmy Carter gave his famous malaise speech. He never used that term. The president said the country's economic woes were due in part to a crisis of confidence in the country. It has come to be known as perhaps the most politically tone-deaf speech in modern American history.
Looking at the Biden administration, you just said that they are producing a message on the economy that is far more positive than people are feeling, right? They're calling it the Biden boom. They're highlighting these top-line numbers. We've seen the same thing, Josh, happen with Afghanistan. The message was so positive, it wouldn't be Vietnam. And we just had, the pictures are worse. It was just a shit show. So is this endemic of the Biden administration's messaging, that they're kind of just trying to put a positive spin on everything and they may look delusional in doing so?
So, Justin, I wrote a column right after the Afghanistan crisis pointing to the three C's of where Biden has come up short: compassion, credibility, and competence. You pointed to the credibility angle. I mean, that was sort of the early warning sign that something's amiss with the Biden White House when they were saying all kinds of rosy spin about against what we were seeing with our very own eyes about the chaos in Afghanistan. They said things that weren't true, that they had to correct, that they looked out of their element at every level of this administration and the national security level. The lack of compassion when people were literally dying. We saw it was a horrible moment of 13 of our own American soldiers killed as part of the attempt to rescue as many Afghans as possible, but there was just a lack of compassion and, the competence. This is the administration that was elected because they were going to turn around the incompetence of the Trump years.
Let's jump into these Senate primaries. I just have one question for you, and it's a little bit more meta. In specifically Ohio, I don't consider Ohio a swing state. Feel free to correct me. We do have a race from J.D. Vance and Josh Mandel, and these people are just saying racist, contemptible, xenophobic shit. So I want to know from you, is this the future of GOP primaries? And will this hurt these candidates in more purple states once they get to the general elections?
I'm glad you asked that, Justin, because I actually just wrote a column about the Ohio Senate primary. And I did quite a bit of reporting with all the campaigns, talking to a lot of the players involved in that race. And the reality is, Josh Mandel looks like a paper tiger, and he looks awfully weak for a so-called frontrunner in that primary. Every poll that's out there, internals and public polls alike, show him stuck at about 20%, maybe 25%, even in his own or his allies polling by the Club for Growth. Those are glaring warnings for the Mandel campaign. It suggests that his message, his strategy really isn't working all that well. And his negatives are awfully high as well in a Republican primary. J.D. Vance, who's probably the second best known of all the Republican candidates, is also in trouble politically. And Vance has ridiculously high negatives in a Republican primary. The one poll showed him near 40% negatives in the Republican primary in Ohio. So these two Republicans get the most attention. I'm not at all convinced that they're going to be the nominee in Ohio once the primary takes place in May. A lot of times, we're very impatient in our social media, 24/7, Insta tweet news cycle. We kind of make assumptions and don't kind of look ahead. We kind of use the past as our guide rather than looking ahead to the future. And while I would say that Trump still holds a pretty strong grip on the mood of the party, some of the more extreme elements of Trumpism and Trump himself, started with the kind of election denialism that he purports, that he talks about on a regular basis. I don't think there's that big of a constituency in the party, at least to have a candidate like Mandel who just tweets about it all the time. And that's the main message that they're putting out there. So I actually think what you're seeing is something of a merger taking place between the Trumpist wing of the party and the mainstream, or the establishment. I don't know, mainstream might not be the right word, but the establishment wing of the party. And you're going to see candidates like that are maybe a little more like Ron DeSantis, where they want to fight masking in schools, or they're going to play up critical race theory, and they're going to run on cultural issues that Trump really championed himself as president and as a candidate as well. But I think a lot of the most Trumpy candidates, the ones who are literally trying to run on the worst aspects of Trump, on the election denialism, on looking back at 2020, they're not doing that well. If you actually look at the Senate landscape at large, it's not just Ohio. You got Mo Brooks, who was a guy who's congressman who was at the January 6th rally and said all kinds of nutty things. He's now losing ground to a much more mainstream Republican candidate who used to work for Senator Shelby in Alabama. You have Pennsylvania. You have a primary in Pennsylvania, which is a little wacky, but it's between a celebrity doctor, Dr. Oz, and a hedge fund co-owner, the new candidate in the race, David McCormick, who's also the husband of former Trump national security official Dina Powell. That's a little wacky. Dr. Oz might not, in another universe before Trump, may not have been a serious Senate candidate, but he's also not running on election denialism either. He's kind of running on COVID-related issues, on the cancel culture, as he puts it. I think what you're seeing in reality is sort of almost like a merger between sort of the more politically palatable elements of Trumpism, frankly, more mainstream or more credible candidates that are emerging in many of these big Senate races.
So I want to take a hard turn now and look at post-2022. Kevin McCarthy is generally seen as weak and feckless behind closed doors in D.C. By consultants, by a lot of people in the GOP. He even got bullied out of running for Speaker the first time around by Walter Jones in that infamous letter because of his alleged improprieties. But also Kevin McCarthy doesn't have the support of the crazies of the party. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Boebert, and there's just this kind of division that is emerging that almost reminds me of what happened with the original House Freedom Caucus and Tea Party with John Boehner. Is Kevin McCarthy at risk when they retake the House of running into problems controlling the speakership?
So this may be something of a counterintuitive answer, but McCarthy's ability to govern effectively is directly related to how many seats he's able to get net in the grand scheme of things. If he only gets 10 to 15 seats, say, enough to get the majority, but a very narrow majority. And by the way, that would be given the polling, given the national environment, the way it looks right now, that would be a massively disappointing night for Republicans if they only got 10 seats and barely took the majority back. That would count as a real disappointment. Maybe
Are you looking at more like 30 or 40?
I'm looking maybe more at 25. I would say 20. Well, look, we don't I shouldn't put a number on anything right now because we just don't know where all the lines are going to be, where redistricting is how redistricting is going to hash out in the remaining states. So there is a little bit of movement left once we see New York and Pennsylvania and Florida figure out what their maps are going to look like for this year. The way the environment looks right now with Biden's approval at the low 40s, the depth of antipathy, the economic malaise, and we may be in a better situation COVID wise by the fall of 2022, but it doesn't look that way right now. It's possible you could have some internal rivals that crop up if they win the majority, but it's by a very narrow margin. But the big point is, like, if he gets 25, 30 seats, if it's a wave election, I mean, if he gets 35 seats, 36 seats, I believe, that would be the House Republican high watermark going all the way back to the Great Depression in the late 1920s. So, if he has a healthy majority to work with, I think he can more easily brush back the threats and the craziness of a Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene and all these other members in the caucus. I don't think they're going to be able to make up the difference. But if he's, dealing with the kind of majority that Pelosi's dealing with her party right now, Katie bar the door. It's going to be chaotic. He may not even have a clear path to be speaker in that situation. But even if he does, then you have folks on the far right who can really kind of make his life miserable and hold, make it harder for him to maneuver around the Republican caucus. So I think that odds are very heavily the odds favor Republicans taking the House, given they only need about 5 or 6 seats to get there. But the margin that McCarthy has to work with is going to make a huge difference in whether he's beholden to the far right or whether he's going to have a lot more wiggle room to deal with that.
There's this ongoing feud within the GOP that seems to be escalating now. It's fueled by new comments from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who compared mask wearing to the Holocaust.
We can look back in a time in history where people were told to wear a gold star, and they were definitely treated like second-class citizens, so much so that they were put in trains and taken to gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And this is exactly the type of abuse that Nancy Pelosi is talking about.
Kevin McCarthy has a problem in our conference. He doesn't have the full support to be speaker because there's many of us that are very unhappy about the failure to hold Republicans accountable, while conservatives like me, Paul Gosar, and many others just constantly take the abuse by the Democrats. I've demanded it. I want Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney kicked out of the GOP conference.
Do you respect the Republican leadership right now?
No, I don't respect them at all. I can't respect leadership that doesn't hold people accountable.
You're very plugged into the mood in D.C., what's going on. Who would you look at in the House as potential future leaders or influence makers?
Yeah, I mean, I would put Stefanik at the top of the list and the House. Part of being a good politician, sadly, is almost being something of a political chameleon, not having, firm ideological views, not being principled like Liz Cheney has shown. Stefanik was a moderate, was someone who was seen as sort of like this great establishment hope when she first ran and was supported. And now she's moved far to the right and has been kind of a Trumpy lawmaker, especially in the last few years. Scalise, Congressman Scalise, I think is, being in the leadership chain is someone also to pay attention to. And look, if Republicans have a wave election, if they elect members of Congress from some of these suburban districts that Democrats now hold, there's going to be a new way. I mean, this is sort of my glass half full type of thinking. But just as Democrats elected a lot of moderate lawmakers from swing districts when they took back the House in 2018, if Republicans have a really good night, they're going to be electing suburban lawmakers who are from Democratic-leaning districts or competitive districts that are not going to be all that Trumpy. If Republicans have a big night, you kind of immediately think that this is going to be, a big victory for Trump. But it also could bring in a bunch of new faces, of new Republican lawmakers from tougher districts that could end up being a lot more pragmatic, a lot more adept, a lot more willing to hear the other side out than you see from some of these safe Republican seats. Most lawmakers kind of act according to their own best political interest. And, if it's in your political interest to make sure you're appealing to a wider range of voters in a general election, because you're in a swing district. That's the behavior you're likely going to see from some of these new lawmakers if they get elected in these types of seats. So I mean that would be the best case scenario, that you have new Republicans that are not all that Trumpy, and they're from districts that they have to sound reasonable to win re-election.
We will go to Shanette. Shanette, over to you.
You talked about how Biden has had an inability to tack to the middle, and that was the expectation. And I'm wondering, do you think that they're going to pivot, and that Biden and the more moderate Democrats might start trying to put up bill after bill after bill that are much narrower, focused on the things that have a lot of support through the country and on both sides of the aisle? Or do you think they're going to continue sort of banging their heads against the wall, doing all or nothing types of legislation?
One thing that just really is confusing to me is there is, on the issue of election administration, voting rights, there is bipartisan effort right now to actually deal with the very issues that Trump played a role in Trump disrupted at the end of after the 2020 election. There are efforts right now between Republicans and Democrats, a pretty ideologically diverse group of lawmakers in the Senate, and I would have expected Biden to kind of pivot to that, to the changes to the Electoral Count Act, to vote counting reforms that actually do have some support on both sides of the aisle. And yet you're not seeing any interest in that from the base. You're not seeing any interest in that, and you're not seeing any interest in that from the White House right now. Like that is something that actually solves like the glaring problem that so many folks are kind of screaming about. That actually could make a real difference, and it actually would deal with the problem at hand. And yet there's been very little interest in actually accomplishing something and actually making change for the better. And there's been a much greater willingness to demagogue it.
The Electoral Count Act revisions would definitely satisfy my biggest concern and be the most pragmatic thing that the Biden administration can do to protect democracy, which is one of their taglines, I believe. We will go to Brent, and then we will go to Megan. Brent, over to you.
Hey, how are you? And thanks for doing this. So my question is, if you could pretend to be Nate Silver for a second, what sort of percentage would you put on kind of the outlier case that the Democrats keep control of the House and Senate? If you assume that to be true, what would make that case occur starting from here until Election Day?
Yeah, so without having thought about it a whole lot, my kind of instinctive figure would be about 5% for Democrats holding the House. What would make that situation possible? It would be the inflation situation being truly transitory. And so it would literally, we'd see stores fully stocked, prices going down or at least holding firm in the next few months. If you were looking for the best case scenario, it's the economy getting better, inflation namely subsiding, and Omicron burning out, and all of a sudden COVID's over. That you really are in an endemic phase where most people don't really have to worry about the public health guidelines. That would be the best case scenario. Even in that best case scenario, the fundamentals and the historical dynamics of elections still would give Biden and Democrats a pretty tough challenge. As far as the Senate goes, a few months ago, I would have said 50-50, that the environment was really good for Republicans, but you don't know about the candidates in some of these races, that they could blow some very winnable races like we saw in 2010 and 2012. I said 50-50 a few months ago. I'd probably say about 65-35 that Republicans can net that one Senate seat to give them the majority. But there's a lot more uncertainty in that Senate forecast because we don't know the nominees, because there are some really problematic Republican figures that could end up winning nominations.
Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you, Josh, for coming on the show and giving us your really great insight. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the political risk that the Republicans face with respect to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, trying to think of some of the other wingnuts, Lauren Boebert, the folks that are out there saying not just horrible, racist things, but they've also got the crazy like conspiracy stuff that is very much a part of their their personality, I suppose. And more concerning, they're the ones raising a lot of money. So would appreciate your insight.
So it's a problem in as much as their craziness, to put it bluntly, is affecting the Republican Party in the House, or, writ large, their ability to govern or their ability to follow their preferred agenda. One of the things that I always bring up in a lot of these types of conversations is that there always have been wingnuts in both parties going back, decades. But in our cable news centric media ecosystem, in our Twitter social media dominated ecosystem, these folks get a lot more attention. In the 80s, there were some really crazy Republican congressmen that you would never have heard of, because they just didn't get the same degree of celebrity, because, politics was still kind of local. There is a growing faction in the Republican Party that is Trumpist, that lives online, that thinks the crazy, right? As far as governing goes, though, I think they're more nuisances from a governing perspective, unless the Republican majority is narrow in 2022.
We will go to Dr. Danish, and then we will go over to Erica.
Hi, Josh. Thank you for answering our questions. I was going to ask more around the recent clash between Trump and DeSantis, and specifically around how DeSantis has handled questions about the booster, and how Trump went on Candace Owens and spoke about how he's been boosted and so on, to sometimes a lot of pushback. How much of a factor does the push behind DeSantis and possibly the overlap with the anti-vaccine movement affect Trump and the Republican Party at large?
That's a great question. And I actually think you've pinpointed one of the leading fights within the Republican Party in 2022. Between Trump and DeSantis. Trump has been irritated, reportedly, that DeSantis has not pledged he won't run for president. He's been threatened, I think, by DeSantis's growing popularity in conservative Trumpy circles. Trump certainly has a hold on a lot of Republican Party voters, but I think some of that widespread support you see in polls is just reflective of the fact that he's a former president, has universal name ID. It is a high watermark, so to speak. DeSantis is the future of the party, whether he is literally, like whether he is the next nominee, or whether he is going to be a major player in presidential politics. His view of politics, like anti-media, culture war politics, take off your mask, like let's get back to normal, like just kind of like in your face conservatism focused on a lot of these cultural hot button issues. It is, I think, sort of the merger that you're seeing between the two sides of the Republican Party. And I'm actually a little surprised that DeSantis hasn't deferred to Trump. But the fact that he's not, and the fact that they're both very subtly going after each other, is very significant. The fact that Trump all of a sudden is saying things at odds with this very right-wing base that he's held like with a vice-like grip, that is something that could cause him problems in the future. And I think DeSantis sees that, is capitalizing on that, and it could preview a very fascinating battle for the future of the Republican Party going forward.
What do you want to leave the audience with? It can be about anything. It could be state of democracy, GOP, Biden. It could be positive, negative, or somewhere in between. But do you have any last thoughts you want to leave us with, where we just come away thinking, that was interesting?
Well, first off, Justin, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for all the great questions out there. I really enjoyed spending time with you guys. Just off the cuff, I'm a glass half full kind of analyst. I tend to think it's easy to feel pessimistic and easy to feel, just like it seems dark all the time. And it's not hard to these days with the state of our politics, the state of our governance. But, oftentimes, as the saying goes, it's it's dark before the dawn. And, I do think that as we see our politics play out over the next few years, you can only raise the crazy so much. Like even Trump is finding, minimal benefit from just bringing up the old hits, bringing up the same talking points day in, day out, rally after rally. You're seeing on the Democratic side. We didn't talk as much about the Democratic Party divisions, but there's really a limit to where the left and the extremes in the Democratic Party have been able to get things their way. They've seen democracy itself like work to their disadvantage, that the middle has reasserted itself across the country. We've seen elections in 2021 where, the more moderate Democrats won primaries. You're seeing Republicans emerge in some of these big Senate and House races that are not beholden to the craziest of Trump, even though, it's everything's relative. It's not like we were before 2016, but there are some reasons for optimism even on the Republican side as well. So, ultimately, I'm an optimist about democracy. I actually think when you leave it up to the American people writ large, they often have a better handle on who on candidates and who would be better leaders than some of the loudest voices on Twitter. Whether it's in Alabama where you have a more moderate candidate that's making inroads, or in Pennsylvania where the craziest candidate dropped out and you're seeing a more mainstream candidate jump in. I think there are signs that the crazy is starting to burn off a little bit. So I'm hopeful that the midterms will kind of offer a course correction. Will be a glaring, we'll show democracy working, and that voters want leaders to go to the middle, to govern from the middle, to work in a bipartisan direction. There was a lot of things to be worried about, a lot of things to be concerned about, but I think sometimes the more optimistic green shoots, so to speak, get overlooked, and I think there are a lot of them to look forward to in the coming year.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Josh and National Journal, to our guests for their questions, and to you for being here. As a quick reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask a question. We welcome voices from across the political spectrum. Our one rule is to keep it civil. For a schedule of live events, as well as past episodes, and to sign up for our newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox twice per month, please visit our website, pm101.live. Our next episode on Monday will feature Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times. It was an incredible conversation about what's happening on the world stage at very high levels between nations as Russia builds up military forces along the borders of Ukraine. If you go ahead and subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now, that'll make sure you don't miss it. And if you really like or dislike what you hear, leave us a rating. All jokes aside, it's a huge help as our community grows. It takes literally 2 seconds, and we will be forever grateful to you. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.